Anyway, tonight we have a postponed talk by one of our key philosophers here, who is representing the multitude of our faculty, because he is so opposed to many of the ideas of other professors of EGS. And unfortunately this year not enough are here to have a real fight. I still have this idea one day, but you and him will engage at EGS in a talk about Deleuze or anything else. But anyway, our speaker tonight is one of these independent minds known for many years as street philosophers against all these academic guys, right? Walking and writing. And he writes everyone out of the room, so to speak. And is always on the move, and all his books are quite very profound and very important. And when you talk to him, and half of you did, you know he's already his mind on his next books. Still, tonight he obviously does something going back into the history of philosophy, engaging two philosophers of the tradition. And I'm very curious how this will turn out, but I'm sure it will be quite interesting. So please welcome Manuel DeLanda.
Hi everyone. Well, tonight I usually talk about Gilles Deleuze. I'm going to be talking about Gilles Deleuze too. I teach a class about that. Unfortunately now dead French philosopher who was unique among his generation of being a hardcore materialist philosopher. Materialism used to be popular, used to be widespread in academia at the beginning of the 20th century, particularly among the left, because of course Marxism was materialist, and Lenin criticized very deeply every form of idealism as bourgeois, as reactionary. But as the Marxist project failed and people became disenchanted with it, as phenomenology began to rise again in the 1940s, as sociologists like Garfinkel from ethnomethodology and Lockman and Berger from social constructivism created micro-sociology, which is of course based on phenomenology, and then of course the great wave of idealism that the 1960s and 70s gave us, materialism became forgotten. Deleuze, as I just said, is the greatest materialist philosopher ever. He, of course, poaches or gets his inspiration from other materialist philosophers in history, such as Spinoza, parts of Nietzsche, parts of Bergson. But nevertheless, he's the one who synthesized a new form of materialism that doesn't have any of the problems of the past, of either dialectical materialism or historical materialism, that returns us back again to a world in which we don't only want to engage in representation, but in intervention in reality, causal interventions in reality, which was always the goal of materialism. Materialism, even in its all forms, was always about the exploitation of physical labor, the hunger of poor people in different parts of the world that need to be cured with real food, diseases propagating around the world because of corrupt regimes that did not know how to properly take care of the health of their citizens. All of that became forgotten as we began getting back farther and farther inside our heads, farther and farther inside simply the world of experience and simply the world of our experience. So Deleuze declared his intentions very clearly when he came. Of course, materialism, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Materialism has, of course, many branches and many areas. One can study a philosophy of nature, and I've done several talks here about philosophy of nature, including my last year presentation. But eventually, even a materialist has to come to terms with experience, has to come to terms with this virtual reality, in quotes, that my brain is producing right now, in which you guys have represented in my consciousness from a certain angle. That is still the holy grail of philosophy, It is, to me, equally important with a philosophy of nature, a philosophy of mind, and a philosophy of experience. It doesn't matter how much of a materialist one is. One has to eventually come to terms with experience, with consciousness, with awareness. However, choices are perfectly clear, and Deleuze made his intentions clear when his very first book was called Empiricism and Subjectivity, a book about Hume. It was his very first book ever. Then he wrote a book about Kant, but in interviews he said repeatedly that yes, I wrote a book about Kant, but about as one writes a book on an enemy. Now that contrast is a little exaggerated because, as Wolfgang was reminding me earlier on, in their own time, Hume and Kant were quite compatible. Kant read Hume. Hume knew about Kant. The two positions had not yet begun to diverge tremendously. So I still use Kant as my example, despite the fact that I know there is plenty of overlap with Hume, because the tradition that then followed Kant, from Kant to Hegel to Husserl to Heidegger, and then of course ending up in French world with Derrida, kept pushing Kant farther and farther and farther away from materialism, farther and farther away from what could have been a different development of Kantianism. And then Kant, of course, the transcendental categories with which he thought, and I'm going to explain this in more detail in a second, we organize experience, became arbitrary signifiers, and we ended up in the 20th century what is called neo-Kantian theory of experience. It's not even Kant anymore. It's a kind of conventionalized Kant, in which conventional arbitrary signifiers is what allows to cut out the world of experience and to make sense of the world of experience. Now, to give you an image, okay, just wanted to give you a very strong image to keep in your head before I start getting into technical terms of what the options are here. And in this is an example that was used by Sapir and Worf, two famous linguists, American linguists of the 20th century. They used to study different civilizations, different cultures, including Eskimos, and the example comes from them. And in what I'm going to say, in what follows, I'm going to stereotype Eskimos very unfortunately, so I tell you what, if you're an Eskimo out there, you get to make 3 Mexican jokes at the end of the conversation. Can be siesta jokes, can be mariachi jokes, can be taco jokes. It's fair game, because I'm going to be stereotyping you right now. The question here is, and this is the image I want you to keep in your head. Do Eskimos see 29 kinds of snow because they have 29 words for snow? In other words, it is the words that cut out the world of experience into 29 kinds, and so the 29 kinds are produced by the 29 words. Or, and this is the alternative, Eskimos have 29 words for snow because they touch, smell, walk on, build igloos with, hunt over 20 real, objective, mind-independent kinds of snow.